So let's just talk a little bit about and give a broad overview of how different the coverage has been of what we are seeing in California and Oregon and, just all over the American West from what we've seen about climate catastrophes in the global South. Let's just, we can do a broad overview and then zero in on some incidents if we'd like.
Sure, I should probably begin by saying I've been covering climate change for 30 years now, and I've reported on it from 25 countries around the world for leading outlets in the US and abroad. So I've spent a lot of time in the global South and in the global North. And I have to say that until the last couple of years, the climate silence in the United States media in general has been deafening. So it is nice to see that in this year, we finally are seeing major mainstream news organizations treating the climate story with the degree of attention and visibility and depth that it has long required. They're late coming to the party, but I'm glad that they're here. So I don't want to be misunderstood here in criticizing that. However, it is unmistakable that there is a really, I think, shameful double standard when it comes to the global South, because the global South has been living with the kind of heat and fires and other sorts of disasters that we're now rightly taking attention to here in the States. They've been living with that for a very long time, and it's largely been ignored by most of the news media, especially here in the United States.
Well, I mean, it's not a new phenomenon that I think is isolated to climate coverage. One, you're right. I'm glad that there is at least some focus on climate in the media, where throughout the 2000s, leading up to, I think, maybe even 5 years ago, most of climate conversation was, well, this side says this. This side sides with the majority of scientists and says that it's real. And this side says it's probably not real, which was just one of the most indicative and infuriating double standards of what we see in the media of false equivalent, or I should say it's a false equivalence that they do consistently. Just, I think, rewind a little bit and talk about how that was such a damaging phenomenon. And then, of course, now we're in the era of, oh, this is going to be Western centric, white centric, Americentric coverage, the only way that you're going to get climate discussions in major news outlets.
Sure. I have to say again, because I've spent so much of my career overseas and have worked for leading news outlets in Europe and Asia and other parts of the world, I have to be really blunt here. It is only in the United States that you had that kind of false equivalence in climate coverage. You can go back to the 1990s in Europe, our colleagues in Europe in the media, none of them, none were giving that kind of credence to the climate deniers because the science was already very clear. And it's quite striking that in those years, the governments in Western Europe, our allied governments, were mainly run by right of center political parties. And even those political parties were not arguing about whether climate science was real. Of course, they argued about what you do about it, who pays, do we tax, do we regulate, all that stuff, normal political conversation. But there was none of this nonsense that you saw throughout the 1990s and into the 2000s. And even as you said, Emma, until quite recently, you would see on major network newscasts this false equivalence. Or what you really saw was, as I said earlier, climate silence. They shied away from the climate story because they saw it as political. And I think that's been the single greatest error that the United States media has made on the climate story historically, is that they've treated a science story as if it were a political story, a politics story. And on a politics story, rightly or wrongly, newsrooms strongly feel that you have to give equal weight to both or all sides. And there's an argument for that if you're talking about whatever it may be, housing or inequality or abortion rights or gun rights or what have you, that you should hear both sides. But when it's science, that no longer applies. We do not talk about whether the earth is flat or not on the air. We do not give credence to tobacco scientists, and we should not have ever been giving credence to climate deniers when it came to science.
Well, Unfortunately, in the United States, though, we see the politicization of science. We see it because, one, there was massive amounts of fossil fuel donations that were fueling Republican politicians and Democratic politicians to a lesser degree. And we're seeing it now with the vaccine debate. This is a scientific, clear-cut, factual understanding that if you get the vaccine, you are a lot less likely to have serious illness or death from COVID-19. And yet we're still having these conversations. Right wing media has, and I know this is a bit of a diversion, but giving people the context of how immense climate denial has been in the United States, especially comparatively. Fox News has now moved from denying that climate change is happening to denying that it's man-made to now, well, it's happening, but we don't really need to do anything about it. I mean, that's really there was never a reckoning with all of the false coverage from before. And now this is just where we're at. And I mean, just talk about that dynamic a little bit, wrecking with that.
Sure. Look, this is a country that has, as you point out, Emma, has long had, at best, an ambivalent attitude towards science. We are a country that, until quite recently, I think the Pew polls were showing that 54% of Americans don't even believe in evolution. You know, we have a very strong and deep in our history religion that really, in many people's minds, is more important than science, or they feel threatened by science. But we have to remember, as journalists, our job is to tell the truth as best we can ascertain it. It is not to basically cotton to people's prejudices and ignorance. And I say ignorance, not stupidity. It's not that people are stupid, but if you're ignorant of something, like COVID can really kill you if you don't get a vaccine, then you're going to act like people are now. And you know, we sadly, very sadly, see that the infection rates are simply much, much higher in places that are not vaccinated and that are not getting vaccinated. So yes, this is a problem that pervades outside of the climate space. And yet, as you mentioned in passing, a lot of the climate disinformation was paid for by the fossil fuel companies. And one of the things that we're doing now at Covering Climate Now, which, just so people know, we are a global consortium of hundreds of news outlets around the world and across the US, including, I should say, NBC News and MSNBC, the owners of, or at least your colleagues there at Peacock. We work together to basically improve climate coverage in all of our newsrooms. And one of the projects that we are just launching this summer with The Guardian newspaper, which has been our lead media partner, we call it Climate Crimes. And we want to put back to the center of the public narrative around climate change the fact, as investigative journalism pointed out a few years ago, that Exxon knew. Its own scientists were telling the top executives of Exxon 40 years ago that our products are going to make this planet uninhabitable if we continue this way. And it's not just that Exxon knew, it's also BP, it's also Chevron, it's basically all the big oil companies. They've known for 40 years. And what did they do? They lied about it. They not only did they keep that information to themselves, they lied about it. And they lied to us in the press, they lied to the public, they lied to policymakers in order to keep their profits flowing. And that's why we are seeing the kinds of fires and terrible downpours and flooding that we're seeing all around the world now. Everyone on this earth right now is living in a crime scene. And the crime is those 40 years of lies. So that's what we're trying to bring to the fore here with Covering Climate Now through The Guardian. Folks can look us up online at coveringclimatenow.org.
Hi, I'm Sam Seder. You can watch the rest of this interview and more on our Peacock show, which streams at 5 p.m. weekdays on The Choice from Peacock TV.